Please be seated. Scene 1. Jesus says to the disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." And they get in the boat. A storm comes. Jesus is asleep. "Don't you care that we are perishing?" He stills the storm and says, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" Scene 2. Jesus says, "You get in the boat and go by yourselves to the other side. I'm going to go pray." So they go, and a wind comes up, and they strain against the oars all night long. He's watching from the mountain. And early in the morning, he comes strolling up to them, walking on the water, and they cry out, terrified, thinking that it's a ghost. But he says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid," and gets in the boat, and the wind ceases. And Mark says, quote, "They were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves." Which is a weird way to end that story, don't you think? With a mention of bread. But hang on, because there's still scene 3. Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees. They want a sign from heaven. He says, "No chance," and leaves and gets into a boat with the disciples and goes, where? To the other side. No wind this time, no storm, but the disciples are still afraid. Why? Because they have only one loaf of bread. Now, Jesus knows that one loaf is plenty, but they're stressed out, and he says, "Watch out, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod," which goes right over their head. And they say, "It's because we forgot to bring many loaves of bread." But Jesus says, "Why are you talking about having no bread? We have one loaf, that's enough. Do you not yet understand?" 3 scenes, 3 sea crossings to the other side, with storms that give way to this talk about yeast and bread. What is going on? It has long been noted, in the words of one scholar, that the enmity between Jew and Gentile, which manifested at every level of politics and culture, was considered during the time of the New Testament to be the prototype of all human hostility. Okay? The prototype of all human hostility. Jews and Gentiles are people who could not get along. And the idea that Jews and Gentiles could be integrated into a single functioning community was inconceivable. We see Paul wrestling with this in every letter that he writes. And I wonder if maybe we can even think of some contemporary examples. Can you think of 2 groups of people who simply cannot, will not, may not ever get along and come together to form a single community? Can you come up with a couple of groups? All right, now imagine someone you trust deeply telling you, yes, they can be integrated. I know how to do it, and you're going to help me. Now you're in the boat. The first voyage to the other side that we heard this morning is more than just a cool narrative about how awesome Jesus is. I mean, it is that, but it's also part of a much larger story that includes us. A story about uniting groups that seem impossible to unite. When this first voyage starts, they are on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee. The other side is the Gentile side. And so when they leave, the disciples are already in a state of anxiety. But then there's this storm, and Jesus is asleep, but they make it to the other side, where they are met by, do you remember this? A guy with not just one, but a legion, as in Roman legion, of unclean spirits, which get sent into a herd of pigs and drown in the sea. And that guy becomes an evangelist to the Gentiles, spreading the good news on his side of the lake. And Jesus and the disciples go back to the Jewish side. And there's a whole bunch of healings, and Jesus begins to send the disciples out, giving them authority to cast out demons and anoint with oil and cure many who are sick, all among their own people. And they do it, and it works, and it's great, and they return and tell him all that they had done and taught, and he says, "Great, come away to a desert place and rest." But a crowd follows them, right? How are we going to feed them all? Well, how much do you have? 5 loaves and 2 fish. And what happens? All 5,000 are fed, right? It's at this point that Jesus makes the disciples get into a boat and go to the other side by themselves, where presumably they are to continue with the healing and the return to wholeness and the integration. But voyage 2 doesn't go so well. He's off praying, and they're in the boat trying to get across, but there's this wind. There are forces that oppose the work of integration. There are strong winds of don't change. As one scholar puts it, all the power of the established symbolic universe of segregation oppose this journey. And no doubt the real-life social hostility to such a project of integration actually threatened to drown Mark's community. But Mark insists that Jesus will rescue this project and silence the winds of opposition. The people on this side and the people on the other side cannot get along, cannot be integrated. Everyone knows this. The winds opposing that integration are powerful. Only Jesus knows that it's possible. And in our own Christian work, doesn't it feel often like we are straining against an adverse wind? And doesn't it feel very often like Jesus is letting us struggle with that? The second voyage is actually a failure. They don't make it to the other side. The winds of adversity actually prevent them from crossing, and they land back on the Jewish side, where there is more healing, and the Pharisees step up their confrontation and demand a sign from heaven. But the only sign that Jesus will offer is a very earthly vision of a new order where all can be fed and satisfied, a vision of one loaf that is enough for all. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves. So they failed to get to the other side by boat, but they do make the trek to Gentile territory on foot, where they are surrounded by a large crowd. How are we going to feed all these people? How many loaves do you have? 7 and a few small fish. So just as he fed 5,000 on the Jewish side, he now feeds 4,000 on the Gentile side. And after another journey and another confrontation with the Pharisees, they get back into the boat and go where? To the other side, where this conversation about loaves and the yeast of Pharisees and the yeast of Herod takes place. The group that Mark calls Pharisees is absolutely opposed to any kind of integration on the grounds of purity, on the grounds of maintaining proper social boundaries, on the grounds of not mixing things that they think should not be mixed. Another group, who Mark calls the Herodians, actually supports a type of integration, but it's the type of integration that means everyone has to adapt to the dominant culture and submit to the empire. The integration that Jesus is interested in, that Jesus calls us to, that Jesus knows is possible and that we are to work for, is neither of those. It's something different. It requires neither purity nor assimilation. And that's why he warns about the leaven of either of these groups, because it's toxic to his project of true integration, wholeness contained in one loaf. The Jewish side and the Gentile side, separation or integration, with all the power of the established symbolic universe in opposition, with all of the real world hostility towards God's project of wholeness and health and well-being for all. This is what Mark's community and the communities that Paul wrote letters to are constantly dealing with. Do we know anything about this? Is the gospel relevant to anything at all in our lives? Do we live in a world riven by intransigent, totally incompatible worldviews? We are very much in that boat, aren't we? We are in that storm, straining at the oars, straining against winds that blow hard against health and wholeness and enough for all. But hear the good news of Mark. Mark insists that Jesus will rescue this project and silence the winds of opposition. We just have to keep rowing. We just have to keep doing the work and trusting that with God, no storm is too great, and that one truly integrated loaf that all can truly share is more than enough. Amen.